Everybody. Welcome, everybody. It's always my pleasure to be gathered today with you all. Women's Canadian Club of Hamilton, Wednesday, March 16, 2022. We begin our session today. As you know, I'm Louise Noel, President of the Canadian Women Club of Hamilton. Thank you for joining us today. For new individuals, thank you for being here. We recognize and acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, Wampong Agreement. Might we not only learn about the Indigenous people of Canada, but from them. The WCCH is striving to continue to be a group of people concerned about issues that affect women, educating and advocating for those issues in our community. The purpose of the Women's Canadian Club of Hamilton is to foster throughout the Greater Hamilton area an interest in all matters of public concern to strengthen Canadian unity and identity, encourage the education and promotion of Canadian history and heritage, foster an appreciation of Canadian culture and traditions to new Canadians. Our monthly meetings are the third Wednesday of each month at 1 p.m. via Zoom at this moment until we get back to meeting in person. We encourage all our members to invite others to join our wonderful group. Membership is only $25. For members who have business and special projects that they support, they can receive 6 months of free advertising on our website. At this time, I would just like us to pause for a moment as a symbol of all of our members, loved ones, friends that we know that are unwell. Let's take a moment and a short, whether it's a poem, a prayer, just thinking of them, please. So it's now 1:08, so 1:09, I shall continue.
I'm sorry, I don't know what the frame means.
That means you're speaking.
Am I supposed to be saying something? No? Okay, yeah, that's good.
Thank you all. I take this time to introduce, you're welcome. Thank you. I take this time to introduce our guest speaker, Miss Leena Sharma Seth. Leena today will explore what it means to be resource for the work of confronting and challenging biases in the workplace, communities, and within ourselves. A short bio of Leena. With over 20 years of experience in the various leadership roles, both in Canada and in Asia, Leena has worked in nonprofit, consulting, philanthropy, and supplier diversity spaces. Leena's leadership superpowers include her ability to leverage her entrepreneurial spirit, her ability to hold space, and her intuitive ability to create authentically inclusive cultures and organizations. We welcome her today. We kindly ask all members to mute their mic out of respect so the sound does not go through during her awesome presentation she's about to give. Leena, welcome.
Thank you so much, Louise, and what a privilege to be in community with all of you. I'm just going to share my screen here and we can begin. Thank you. So when I was invited to speak with you or to present today, I thought to share something that I've been really settling and grappling with in the last few months that I thought really supports the Break the Bias message of International Women's Day. And so today we're going to resource ourselves and talk through what that looks like. And I won't focus on my land acknowledgement because I appreciate, Louise, you offered one, but it is something integral to my work as well. And I thought to start with the question of, why break the bias? Like, what is your why for this work? And I offer a why for, why I do inclusion, equity, anti-racism, basically cultural transformation work. And so for me, to leave the nonprofit sector where I was before I pivoted into entrepreneurship, it was this recognition that I felt like I could be more effective outside of systems. And I think as individuals, that's a question we should be grappling with, is where am I most effective? Where am I most needed? That's definitely a part of the thinking. And really, I invite, if you feel comfortable, to share in the chat around, like, what is your why? Why do you commit to challenging bias, to creating inclusive spaces? I'd love to just see, folks have a response. So it's an invitation to share it in the chat. And this was the question that I'm asking for folks to, what does it mean to you to work to break the bias? So if you feel so called to do so, you're welcome to share that in the chat. I'm going to hold space for a moment just to see if anyone comes forward with a response. Or if you want to unmute and share, actually, maybe if that's an easier thing to do, I might just stop my share for a moment just to see everybody and say, maybe we can hear from one or two folks as to, what does it mean to you to work to break the bias?
Okay, I'll say something. I had to figure out where the mute button was first. Well, to me, the bias is a lot in the education system where we think, girls don't belong in the math class or the science class. And I experienced that in my own life, where I was told I was taking up an important spot in the advanced chemistry course that really should be filled by a boy, because I would never amount to anything in the science field. Imagine that happening today. So we have got a little bit further, but there's still, I think there's a terrible bias towards girls going into the math and science fields. And it carries over into other parts of life where, different parts of sports and things like that. So to me, that's what break the bias is.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Lee. Does anyone else want to offer, what does it mean to you to work to break the bias? And I see, is it Ekaterini? Did I say that correctly?
Yes, you said it perfectly. I'm sorry, I would turn on my camera, but I'm walking around my campus. I'm trying to go from class to class. But to me, breaking the bias means I always compare like society to a flower, and bias really kind of like takes the petals from the flower. So when you're taking the petals from the flower is incomplete. And I find that that's what bias does to our communities. It takes away all the capabilities, the uniqueness of every individual, as it minimizes them to perhaps ethnicity, sex, gender, identity, all those identity factors. And yeah, I think breaking the bias is really crucial because it allows people to be themselves and embrace their unique identities and aspects of themselves. Like it was said, somebody may have incredible knowledge or just brilliance and talent in the science field, which would be minimized simply because they were born as a woman.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. I will come back to sharing the screen, but if you have something you want to offer, you're welcome to offer it in the chat. I will come back and look for it. later on in our time together. Just going to share that. And so I wanted to address a couple of questions through our conversation today. And so the first one I want to start with is, whose work is it to break the bias? I am hearing some feedback. I wonder, am I just... Okay, and so I'm going to just offer some images here, just some questions. And so really, when we think about equity work, and I want to just offer a caveat that I do take an intersectional approach. So I appreciate we're celebrating International Women's Day. And you'll find as we move through our conversation, I take an intersectional approach, though of course, I appreciate the theme of this month and this day is to really uplift all women. And so when I think about whose work is it to break the bias, is it the work of women? Is it the work of men? Is it the work of white women or white men? Is it the work of racialized women and men? Is it the work of the trans community? Because one of the things I also think about is breaking the bias is an invitation to look beyond the binary of male and female, and to include this idea of justice for all communities who are the victim of bias and oppression because of aspects of their identity. So I appreciate the offers that came a few moments ago around, we experienced bias in education, the reference to the flower analogy and I appreciated the reference to multiple identities and that those are the ways we experience oppression or bias. And so I find oftentimes there's this idea that the folks who are supposed to be working to break the bias are the ones who are experiencing the bias. And I really work to challenge that of course, ultimately it is everybody's job to be challenging bias, whether that's externally, in the system, so the education system, in the healthcare system, wherever there is bias flowing. And I also invite that it's those who have the resources, the power, and the privilege to do so, to be stepping in and making sure that this is a part of their work as well. I'm offering this image here. Some of you may have seen this before, or some version of basically, kind of a social location wheel. And so when I talk about the fact that, whose work is it? And one of my community agreements in the work I do with organizations and groups is, one of my community agreements is our role in this work is different depending on our social location. And so if you look at this circle here, and you see at the center is ultimately those identities that have the most power, the most access to privilege. And so we see right in the center, with respect to citizenship, it's someone who is a citizen, and the person who experiences the most marginalization in that realm is undocumented citizenship. And so of course, I know that's not language that we use here in Canada. This is an American visual, but the ideas are universal. And if you go to the next slice of this pie, so to speak, you see skin color. And so those who are white have the most power, and then moving outward towards the edge of the circles, you see that those who are darker skinned, who are Black, experience more marginalization or have less access to power and privilege. And so it goes through as you move through ability. So, able-bodied versus those who are disabled, sexuality, those who are heterosexual versus those who are lesbian, bisexual, pan, asexual. And it just goes across the whole, and these are only some aspects of identity. I would offer there are a lot more, but why I think it's important when we ask whose work is it, to consider who has the most power and privilege and access to resources. And those who are in the center, from a dominant culture perspective, tend to have the most access to power. And if you think about it, so I'll give you a story just to kind of animate how this plays out in equity work. I was working with a group where there was a person who was sharing after a check-in activity, a story, and he was an older white male. And several times in his story, he used a racial slur. And of course, I dealt with it as the facilitator. I handled it from my end, but in the moment, some of the thoughts that were circulating were, why didn't the person who was in the breakout group, who was racialized, why didn't they challenge this person? They heard these words, but they didn't say anything. And it was the executive director of the organization who was talking to me about this. And I just challenged them and I said, well, it's, is it really reasonable to expect the person who has to live the experience of racism, live the experience of sexism or homophobia or ableism, to have to be the one to challenge it all the time? And so one of the things I really talk about is how important it is for those of us who have more power and privilege to be ready to address these types of issues. And as we move through this conversation today, I will talk about what it means to resource ourselves and what it looks like to be doing the work. But just as an example, because I also lift up Kimberly Crenshaw's, she's a civil rights activist, lawyer, critical race theorist out of the US who coined the term intersectionality. And as I said, I can only do this work in a way that really acknowledges that we are more than the sum of our gender. And oftentimes it's important that we have conversations about gender, about race, about ability, where we are mindful of how our other identities play a role in how we move through the world. It's really not possible for me, for example, to just move through the world and answer questions as a woman, for example, because we all have so many other lived experiences. And so that's really what the opportunity is when we talk about oppression in general, but also recognizing when we're thinking about, whose work is it and what are the opportunities where we see oppression playing out. Who could, who could advance disrupting that? Who could advance conversations or accountability around those issues? It's important to consider these things as well. And then the next question I ask is, what does it look like to work to break the bias? So coming back to kind of the opening question. And so I offer this visual. It's from the National Equity Project. And I appreciate this because many of us, when we think about, I think about what happened with George Floyd's tragic murder in May of 2020 and all of the momentum and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in response, and how many movements grow. When we are kind of responding to those movements and we think about what is my work in this, perhaps we are reading books, we're signing up for training sessions, we're having conversations in our community. And so there's that individual responsibility and that individual response to, okay, start looking at the ways I maybe hold bias. How am I internalizing those ideas of sexism, of patriarchy, and how am I moving in that way? So there's that work, but it's also important. I like to say it's an and conversation. It's about doing that personal work, but also recognizing that if we're not using what we're learning and we're not using our power and our privilege to challenge the systems and the structures that perpetuate oppression, then to me, it's really only half the work, because the harm of oppression is experienced as a community, not just individually. So the repair and the healing will have to happen as a community as well. And so a lot of times the work that I invite people to do, and I'm invited to do, I'm a part of my own community of practice and learning. So I don't stand here in front of you as somebody who has perfected the art of doing this work. I'm on the journey as well. And I have to do this work in community. And so the invitation is to remember that this is not just about personal learning. It's not just about kind of like, okay, I've read all these books and I've listened to these talks, so I'm good. It's about how are you using what you've learned? How are you using what you've learned to influence your circles of trust, right? How are you, helping, your own community to advance and build the resilience that's needed to do this work? And so I just invite this kind of dance between the personal and also systemic, and that really to do this work in a way that creates long-lasting transformation, communities where everybody is included and belongs. We have to come together and we have to challenge the systems and the practices and the policies that perpetuate oppression. So that's kind of the invitation with this image here. And I wanted to just give an example of, what could a system's response to oppression and maybe that moving back and forth between personal and systems look like. And so you'll see on the bottom left-hand side, there's the individual or the intrapersonal level. And so you see what that work looks like is, recognizing where we experience or are holding ideas it's like us as women buying into the idea that, okay, women don't belong in STEM, women are supposed to be at home and men are supposed to work. Like when we as women buy into those ideas, and it's how we've been socialized. So this is not about shame and feeling bad that, oh, I feel this way too. It's about recognizing where internalized oppression lives within us, how it informs our choices and our decisions, and maybe how we treat others, how we make those decisions. And so it's about, getting curious about what are the things that drive my decisions, and how can I disrupt them if they are rooted in things like patriarchy, racism, homophobia, ableism, whatever those are. And then you can come up to on the right-hand side, the interpersonal level. And so you see, this is where when we're in community with each other, perhaps I like to say, if we're doing this work well, we're going to make mistakes. This is about progress over perfection. And so from an interpersonal level, it's about what if you recognize that something you did was rooted in bias, or perhaps was a microaggression to someone else. It's about recognizing, well, how do I take accountability for that? How do I acknowledge to myself? Sometimes it's even harder to admit to ourselves that we've made a mistake. And then how do I engaged in the act of repairing harm? And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's what it means to kind of look at what is my work at an interpersonal level. And then you kind of ladder up to the community level on the upper left-hand side there. And so this is where you recognize, okay, where does oppression play out? So it could look like differential or biased resource allocation. So some neighborhoods in our communities, I'm thinking about the Code Red report in Hamilton, both the first one and then the follow-up, and how telling it was in terms of, I think it was that, between postal codes, one community had a 21-year shorter life cycle, so a shorter lifespan because of the neighborhood they lived in. So it's about thinking about what are the resources and how are things experienced differently, understanding things like racial and gender segregation. And I feel like we're in a moment where we're perhaps seeing less of that, but there are still, I think, in the place of people's thinking and beliefs, that still plays out, where there's a place for women, or there's a place for certain people, or so it's about how do we challenge that. And then the undervaluation of contribution. And so this looks like the invisibilization of communities, of whether that's around gender, race, and all of the kind of different identities, invisibilizing those contributions, because who we consider a leader, who we consider a founder, traditionally looks a certain way. And so how do we challenge those ideas? And then the last piece is this idea of systems level. So in examples of those are immigration policies. Our history as a nation, there are no shortage of immigration policies, for example, where they were exclusive, they were intended in some ways to dehumanize, to invisibilize, and definitely to keep out. To think about things like predatory banking, that all of those, and I feel like in the pandemic, more and more of those seem to have popped up. And how do we think about who is most disproportionately affected by things like that, and how do we and why is it important to focus on those areas first and foremost? And then of course economic policy. So the idea behind this visual was to invite kind of us to kind of be able to start moving more freely from the individual to the systems level, and to be curious about how and where we can interrupt oppression where it's happening. And so just to summarize kind of for this kind of piece, I wanted to add just some additional points. So, breaking the bias work also looks like healing yourself first and foremost. And I think about a quote from Audre Lorde where she said, it's self-preservation and an act of political warfare to engage in self-care. And I like to say, and again, this is based on my own learning from the embodied somatic social justice space, that talks about the fact that the more healed we are, the more powerful we are. And the more that we're in the space of surviving, the less powerful we can be. And the more healed we are, and the more we're moving from a place of thriving, the more more impactful we can be. And I don't offer that from a place of shame or like, well, there's something wrong with us. It's about recognizing that doing the healing work, to be able to move from a place that's settled, strong, spacious, whole, right? Because sometimes I often open my training sessions with an embodiment practice. So it takes 5 to 7 minutes, Because oftentimes you come into this work in your head, right? Your brain is here, but is your body here? Is your spirit, are your emotions here? Because if you think about experiences of oppression, so whether that's being told, like, I've had things like around race, around my, I've come into meetings where when I worked in the nonprofit sector, and I held a director or leadership role, people would be like, well, where's the director? And it's like, I am the, right? There are all those ideas. When we feel those things, and we experience them, those are real experiences, and we have to own those, but also understanding that the more healed we are, the more resilience we have, and we can move through those experiences in ways that enable us to keep moving forward. It's also important that we educate ourselves. And so I really appreciate the month that we're in right now, and my social media is flooded with phenomenal stories of women who have had such an integral role in building this nation, building this community that I'm in. I'm joining you from Burlington, Ontario. And so really educating ourselves, not only on the current context, but the history, right? Understanding, the roots of oppression, because sometimes people, with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic and the unprecedented rise of anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian racism, some people say, well, it's not connected to anything, but really, if you look at some of our moments in history where anti-Asian sentiment was prevalent, and it was called, anti-Orientalism at the time. There's, we can't assume that there are no deep roots to what we're seeing. So if the roots were our history, whatever we're seeing in the branches and the leaves comes from somewhere. And so if we can educate ourselves, it supports us to have conversations and do the work from a place that's rooted in a foundational knowledge. And then the other point I wanted to offer was always moving from your awareness of your social location. So when I showed that wheel, that power privilege wheel, it's important that we're, so how I use that is whatever space I'm invited into, I'm always considering, it's a very fluid thing, because in some spaces I may hold a phenomenal amount of power and privilege. I do recognize that I have, I'm educated, I have post-secondary education, I have postgraduate education, I grew up in a middle-class upbringing, I can speak English, whatever my privilege moments are, I'm very mindful, and it helps me to stay humble and bring humility to the work, because yes, there are ways I've experienced oppression, but there's also ways I experience privilege. And so to be able to hold the tension between the ways that we experience privilege and the ways we experience oppression in context to others that we're with. And so if you're in a space where everybody has the same social location as you, it's a different thing. But if you're in spaces where there's a lot more diversity, chances are you're in spaces where people have different levels of social location and privilege. And so how do we move with the humility that requires, and be curious, decenter ourselves? And so the more privilege and power we have, the more space we're used to taking up. But if we're in spaces where there is diversity, we want to be mindful of how do we make space? How do we get curious about silence? That if there's folks who are in your community who are silent, perhaps they're just not feeling safe enough to speak, or it needs to be an extra level of consideration. And so in some ways, I feel like Zoom is a bit of an equalizer, because you have the chat function. I use a lot of platforms like Jamboards that people can anonymously share feedback without having to unmute and share, because perhaps they don't feel safe enough to share because their manager's in the room, and if they speak their truth about a question, that perhaps it'll mean a consequence, or maybe they won't get a promotion because they spoke up. And so thinking about the ways that those of us who don't have as much power and privilege move a little bit more is what the gift of social location does for us. I also invite us to embrace the 3 Ps. And so build the correct postures. And so what postures is, because I would offer that a lot of times the questions that come to me are like, Leena, like, what are the right words? What are the right phrases I should be saying? What's the politically correct language? And I always say that, instead of being so focused on language, and not that language isn't important, I'm always curious about the postures people bring to the work. Are they curious? Are they decentering themselves? Are they acknowledging, the ways that perhaps they are complicit with systems of oppression? So to me, I can forgive someone who has the wrong language, And I have a lot of latitude for that. And if there's more of an emphasis on, I just want to say the right words, I just want to know the right things. And that tells me that the work to build those postures, those practices, that knowledge is not there. And really, in this moment in time, there is no shortage of knowledge, no shortage of communities who are wanting to engage in these dialogues. And so I feel like in this moment, maybe more so than any other moment, there are such opportunities to build those postures, those practices, and those principles for the work. And then the last one is, what it looks like to break the bias is to challenge oppression whenever and wherever you see it, with a consideration of your social location and how resourced you are. And so I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next kind of part of of our conversation here. And so the question that really I think frames this conversation is, what does it mean to resource ourselves for equity, inclusion, and breaking the bias work? And so when I say resource, it's like this idea of doing the work from a full cup, right? If your cup is empty, how much do you have to give to yourself, to your community, to the work? And so in a simple way, I invite you to consider that resourcing is this idea of how much is in my cup. And so I'm going to offer 3 different kind of sections, or 3 different approaches to considering what it means to move from a full cup or a resource place. And so the first one I want to offer is to understand that in equity work that we're going to be triggered. So, and when I say that, I'm talking about where, maybe not in spaces like this where we probably are more like-minded and we're celebrating something today, but when you're in spaces where there are divergent opinions and diverse opinions, to assume that you're not going to be triggered, to me, is not setting yourself up to be able to sustain yourself for the work. So this visual here comes from somatic and embodiment spaces, and also conflict resolution. My training is conflict transformation, amongst other things. And so what you see here is essentially a trigger experience. And so if you look at the kind of the bottom of, like, on the left-hand side, the trigger, so that is the thing that perhaps maybe you're in conversation with someone and someone says, women don't belong here, or whatever, that's the trigger. And so what happens is and this literally takes seconds, this happens really quickly. You're agitated, you accelerate, and perhaps things speed up in your mind, and your emotions are just, swelling up. And you're feeling super activated, or just like, oh my goodness, I'm really, you're essentially triggered. And then there's typically a peak in the experience. And then it begins to de-escalate, and slowly you begin to recover. And so I invite you to hold this image in your mind and this experience, because really the opportunity is, the more we're aware of our triggers and the more that we can be aware, you can't always stop yourself from having this cycle when you're triggered by somebody or something, but if you can even just notice it to begin with and go, oh, I feel this happening, and begin to notice, okay, how, it can feel like it's taking forever when you're in it, but truthfully, this happens in seconds. It can happen in 30 seconds. And over time, in the early days when you're first working with triggers, it can be a really sharp peak. But over time, it begins to become a softer wave, because you begin to recognize the signs of being triggered. And if you've prepared, and I'll offer something in the next slide, then it helps you to, again, it's what we call resourcing yourself for the work. That, okay, instead of assuming I'm not going to be triggered, I'm expecting that it's possible, right? And then it's about, the next thing is, I like to say something that Jay Shetty, he's a thought leader and former monk, he talks about this idea of having an if-then plan. So, and what that can look like is perhaps sitting down and journaling about, what are the things that trigger me in these conversations? Maybe you can identify 2 or 3 things that you're like, okay, when I hear this, oh, I just lose it, or whatever that headspace is. If you can write them down and then say, okay, if this happens, here's how I'm going to support myself, how I'm going to resource myself. And so it's not the work that you're going to do in half an hour. Again, this is about adopting postures for the work that recognize that this is like, we're trying to turn the Titanic here. This is not a little speedboat, right? We're trying to do, this is the work of our lives, and we're standing on the shoulders of many giants who've been doing this work for a long time. And so I offer that, it's important for us to begin to kind of recognize that, yep, we're going to be triggered, and maybe try to proactively name some of those triggers, and to consider, what would my plan be if I'm triggered in this instance. And so some of the things that I do, even just like to prepare myself, you'll notice I have a cup of tea here. Okay. And so even sometimes the act of holding the cup and feeling the warmth, let alone taking a sip, it reminds me to come back to my body. It reminds me to just come back to the ground, feel my feet on the ground. I also have a diffuser running that when I'm doing these facilitation, because as somebody who is in a brown body, who is a woman, there are instances where I'm triggered. And so for me to act like, or to assume that I'm never going to be triggered is also, to me, a form of, it's irresponsible for me to assume that I won't have triggers. So it's about resourcing myself with things around me. And also I do a meditation practice with ways that I can just easily remember that what the feeling of settled and calm and safe looks like. So I will move on to the next. And so really just learning how to work with our triggers is the opportunity. And then there's this trigger sequence, and I don't know who created this. I couldn't find the resource, so I don't want to say it's mine. It's something that I've come across, but it's a fantastic tool to support you to develop an if-then plan. That, okay, if I can identify what the trigger was, what was the thought behind it that I took on, what was the feeling, what behavior came of it, what was the response in the moment, and maybe there's even well, how would I have liked to have responded? Like that's another way where you can go, again, this is not about beating ourselves up. It's about, recognizing how we respond, knowing ourselves. And then when we want to shift, and if we wanted to see a different outcome, how might we support ourselves to have a different outcome next time, right? Because that is the invitation here. And then the other piece I wanted to offer was adopting a posture of accountability. So this quote here, and again, I don't know who, I was looking, I found it in many places, but accountability can feel like an attack when you're not ready to acknowledge how your behavior harms others. And so when we're, talking, and this is really great for us to understand about ourselves, but also to understand about people we're in conversation with, or maybe even experiencing a difference of opinion with, that if people aren't conditioned to accept accountability for their behaviors and to be curious about, okay, you're saying I've done a microaggression to you. You might feel like you didn't do anything wrong, but I always say defer to the impact of your words, not necessarily the intent, right? So we can have the best intentions behind a statement, but if the result is the person we said that to is experiencing harm, to me, the harm and repairing that harm is more important than us getting over involved in the ego response, which is like, I didn't mean it, my intention wasn't there. And so in this work, it's really important that we're connected to the idea that we can have the best intention, but if we're not aware of our biases playing out, that's going to create some adverse impact. And so how can we adopt those postures that help us to take accountability? And so the offer for when we're resourcing ourselves is to have that commitment to accountability and repairing harm. And so I offer this, it's quick little 4 points. And if you Google Mia Mingus, she is a phenomenal writer, educator, community organizer in the transformative justice and disability justice space. She's a prison abolitionist and a survivor who believes that we have to move beyond a culture of punishment, revenge, and criminalization if we want to break the kind of intergenerational cycles of violence. And so that's a little bit about her. But she offers 4 parts, to kind of like, what does it look like to take accountability? So another thing I do in my work with communities, with organizations and groups is I invite at the outset, if you don't have a self-reflection practice, to adopt one. And so that can look like having a journal. So when I'm doing my sessions over the course of a year with an organization, I'll always say, do you have your journals nearby? Make sure that if something is triggering, you can stop and pause and write it down. And maybe in that moment, you don't have the space and the time to do the work around what does it mean, but to be able to go, I'm going to come back to that because something's there for me to be working with. And then of course, if you've committed harm, it's about the apology practice, right? Developing, in the next slide, I'll offer Mia offers a plan for a good apology, and it's being committed to repair. So if you want people to trust you in this work, it's important that they know that if harm happens, that you're committed to repair. And that takes time, because even if you haven't had that practice before, there may be some even deeper repair work to do, because if you've committed harm and not held yourself accountable, there's work. And the other thing is, some people may not even have space for your apology. The harm has hit them so hard that you can have the best posture and the commitment to an apology, but for some people, they're just not ready to receive the apology. And so it's about being more focused on, am I doing everything I can? And then the changed behavior. So if someone calls you in and says, hey, something you did has really affected me in a way that's hurt me, how do you sit with that and learn from that so that you can shift your behavior so it doesn't happen again? And so I'm sure we can all think of examples of apologies that just fell flat, or did not feel like you're like the person doesn't actually care. They're just saying the words, but the body and the posture is not there. And so I invite you to think about those experiences where you felt like someone hasn't. And I feel like I have children. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. I feel like I'm having these conversations with my children quite often where I'm like, how are you going to make it right? And my daughter was like, oh, sorry, like the eyes rolled, not looking, you can tell it's going through the motions. And so when we talk about what does it mean to repair harm, it's like you don't want to offer an apology that's not authentic. It's about really doing the work and then saying, okay, I understand how I've harmed you. And so next slide offers an example of an apology here. And so, and this is from Mia Mingus on the left-hand side. So of course, it's like, you got to say, I'm sorry, name the hurt and the harm, name the impact. Again, take responsibility by naming your actions, commit to working to not cause the harm again. And then I added the 6th one, that can you let me know if my actions here have helped to repair the harm? Is there anything else I can do to work towards repairing harm? And so again, it's about having that humility and that commitment that this work is bigger than me. This work is about community. This work is about community transformation. And it starts with how I engage with others. And then I offer an example of an apology here. So it's just, again, an example. I'm reaching out to say how sorry I am. And maybe this is an email, maybe this is a conversation, maybe it's a combination. And again, I don't offer this for it to be prescriptive, because you have to find what works for you and what works for the relationship. Like, how invested are you in this relationship going well? But it's just an example. So, I'm sorry I'm reaching out to say how sorry I am for hurting your feelings and causing harm during our staff meeting this morning. I referred to you as she instead of they, as you've asked us all to do. So it's an instance where someone has offered their pronouns and perhaps I used the wrong pronoun. And so then I say, I see that by being dismissive of your pronouns, whether I intended to or not, that my actions were homophobic and indicated to you that I don't see or value your identity. And the last one, I will slow down going forward and make sure I make the time to reference you by the pronouns they, them. So perhaps in this instance, the person has said my pronouns are they, them, and maybe I called them she or he. And I will also work to be more mindful of the pronouns I'm invited to use for any other team member. So by adding that, I'm saying I recognize that this is about how I want to be in my community. And then the last one, is there anything else I can do to work to repair the harm I've caused? And so again, I know this is recorded, so you'll definitely be able to come back to some of these points here, but just wanting to give examples, constructive, accessible examples to what it means to be doing the work and resourcing ourselves. And so in the last piece, I really want to focus on, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Resma Menakem, his book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. And through his work, it's really hit home for me, the reality that there's a lot of trauma and pain in our communities, intergenerational, current day, and that oppression, creates trauma. There's no way around that, right? And so what I've come to appreciate is this quote that, that the importance of doing body work, about doing this in an embodied way, where you're not just in your head, but you're making sure that you're tuning into the wisdom of your body, of where we end up feeling trauma and oppression first. Because sometimes our heads take a moment to make sense of what happened, but our bodies feel it and get it first. And so as he offers here, the body, not the thinking brain, is where we experience most of our pain, pleasure, and joy, and where we process most of what happens to us. And it's also where we do most of our healing, including our emotional and psychological healing. And it's where we experience resilience and a sense of flow. And so I'm going to offer 5 anchors that he offers in this book. So I'll be quick about it. I'm mindful. I'm trying to see what the time is in this moment. And Louise, you can cut me off if I've gone too long, but I thought just to move through these and then we can have space for questions. So he offers 5 anchors. So the first one is soothe yourself to quiet your mind, calm your heart, and settle your body. And so these are 5 practices that you can, if you've been triggered and you're wanting to kind of settle yourself so you can come back to a conversation or follow up or move forward. So it's the invitation to just take that. And so I offer some visuals here. Like for some people, it might be the tea. For some people, it might be lighting some candles, or for others, it might be just like settling and just kind of settling your body. There are some really fantastic, really easy embodiment practices that we can do that help us come back to our bodies. The second one is notice the energy. So if we think about that trigger sequence, not the sequence, the visual of the trigger, the little wave, and to, in the beginning, notice what's happening in your body. So if you can notice, perhaps, what are the, are your hands getting sweaty? Is your chest tight? Is your face getting flushed? Is your stomach, tight? Like, just to start noticing and naming those body and recognize them as wisdom. It's your body. It's a bodily response. It's a physical response. Emotional response. It's information, right? And it's like, hey, something is not right. And so how can you sit with that and be curious about it rather than reacting to it? Because we often are reactionary and we're less responsive in these moments. And the invitation is to build our ability to respond rather than react. The third one is to accept the discomfort. So accept that you're being triggered and notice when it changes instead of trying to flee from it. So, I told you that cycle happens really, really quickly. And so if we can pause and be curious about, okay, I am triggered. And sometimes we want to push it down and say, no, I should not be triggered in this moment. But that doesn't actually, it just prolongs, in my mind, the experience. So if we can accept it, invite it in, give it some compassionate spaciousness, and say, okay, I'm triggered in this moment. Or maybe my peer is triggered and I can see that they're triggered. They may not be able to name that yet, but maybe I can help them settle. And just, so it's this idea that settled bodies can settle others and unsettled bodies will unsettle others. And so when we talk about what's our work, if I can be somebody who in the thick of conflict or in the thick of a difference can still remain settled, it becomes this energy that can be infectious. Right? So to think about it that way, that it's not even just about, if you think about when your children are upset or someone you love is upset, and if you kind of bring that calm settledness to them, they end up kind of settling a little bit, right? And if more of us come into these conversations with that settling energy, it really creates those conditions for transformation. And so, then the fourth one he offers is to stay present, stay in your body. Again, oftentimes we leave our bodies, we're only in our heads because we're so triggered or flooded with emotions, and it becomes that, fight, flight, reptilian brain response, right? So how do we move beyond that and try to respond from the best parts of ourselves? And so over time, this becomes more accessible to us. In the beginning, it's really enough just to start noticing when this happens, so that we can tend to the parts of us that need tending. And then the last anchor that Resmaa offers is this idea of discharging any energy that remains. And so I'll give a quick example of, if you've ever watched a video of kind of in nature of animals, maybe there's a lion chasing an antelope, and perhaps the antelope has an interaction with the lion, but the lion ends up leaving and the antelope is still alive. But you'll notice, I've seen this a couple of times, where the animal starts to shake vigorously afterwards, their skin. And in a way, that is actually what that is. It's about the energy safely discharging. It's about recognizing that they were in a trauma moment, a fight, flight, flee. And there's energy that's still in the body that needs to be released. And so as humans, we have that same need, but we don't always know that that's part of what this is. And so what Resmaa talks about in his book is this idea. And he actually says, it shouldn't be about yoga, about like meditation. It should be about something physical. So dance, playing some sports, so getting out and walking. Maybe that's sometimes when we're angry, we like clean the house. I know I've done that, where I'm like, I'm just going to get to those floors, because if I don't do that, I'm going to fight with my husband or whatever that is. But it's recognizing and naming that there is a need for release, for energy when we're triggered, and maybe our own traumas have been activated. So I leave you with this quote, and then there'll be time for some questions here. It's a quote from Valerie Kaur, and she wrote a book called See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love. And so I won't read this, but I'll leave you to read this. And as you do, I will offer just kind of a closing thought, that the heart of this work is to build our ability to engage meaningfully with difference, to engage meaningfully across difference, and to build our solidarity across difference. And so that last piece comes from Mia McKenzie, who is a queer Black feminist activist. And so, you know, this quote is inviting us to be curious about the stories we hear and the degree to which we take them in. And somebody might need to mute. I'm doing something here, but and the last kind of, you know, for me, I know that I'm doing well when I can celebrate and value and appreciate the contributions, narratives, and stories of cultures that are very different from mine, as much as I love my own. And I think that is the opportunity here. We tend as humans to celebrate what our legacies are, what our culture, what our background, but how do we adopt that same love, that same reverence, that same appreciation for the stories, contributions, and narratives of others who are not like us. And so I will I'll end it there and hold some space for some questions at this point. Well, I know I threw a lot at you, but welcome some questions.
I think most everybody is muted. So if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself and then we can hear you. Questions, anybody? I don't see anybody. Can I just mention something here? I've been scribbling notes, but as you were going through the whole thing, and I admit when I came into today, I was thinking bias, because it was International Women's Day, I was thinking bias about women, about being a woman. And you've certainly opened our eyes to a whole broader spectrum of bias. But I noticed and it's not going to fit in your little wheel, but another bias that I've noticed was brought to my attention by Pat Saunders one day, is a bias against people of a certain age.
100%.
Society thinks that once you hit, 60 or 65, that, oh my God, you're old, you're gray, you're decrepit, you can't move, your mind's going blah, blah, blah. And that's absolutely untrue for a lot of people. It's true for some, it's not true for everybody. But Pat told me one day about this ageism thing, and I thought she was nuts until I actually saw it happening to her right in front of my eyes. And I've been very aware of it since. And I know it doesn't really fit on your wheel, because it doesn't necessarily go that the older you are, the more power you have. It's almost a reverse kind of thing. But that's another thing that another bias that we see in our society.
And I would say it does fit on the wheel. I think what I've come to appreciate about age is that there are some contexts in which being older serves you, and there are some contexts in which being younger serves you. And again, so I feel like age has more fluidity to it, in my humble experience. And again, I'm not as young as I look. I'll leave it there. But I think the truth is that wheel is not. It's not everything. And to your point, there are many, many others that could be there that are not. So I appreciate you so much for what you've named. Thank you, Lee.
The thing about ageism is,
Did you have a question, Christina?
really is something. As we get older, that we're not worthy.
Yeah, you're cutting out, Christina, but I think I heard bits and pieces where you were talking about ageism and that this feeling of
Used as an excuse. So ageism, I certainly
100%, Christina. So the bits I heard, I agree with. I couldn't hear everything you said, but definitely that ageism is needs to be a part of the conversation and the narrative around. And really, we want to cultivate a space where we can speak about all of these things freely without fear of judgment, fear of shame, because I think when we talk about the work to be whole and to be human and to bring all of ourselves, authentically to the table, we need spaces that allow us or invite us to do that. So yeah, so that's definitely a part of this conversation as well.
So, hi,
Anybody else?
Leena. Thanks so
Hi,
much
Karen.
for your presentation. I really appreciate it. Just like the diversity of what you brought forward and just opened us up to. An interesting thing that I have been thinking about is, in speaking with some other women from around the world, and it's kind of like they call it like ancestral mathematics, especially for women. And so in order to be born, I don't know if any of you have heard this, you need 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, 16 great second grandparents, 32 third, and it goes on 64. And obviously the maths works downwards. So in the end, you would need approximately 4,094 ancestors over the last 400 years, which would, yes. So when you go back to age and talking, that's exactly what you said, Lee. And I'm not saying I'm not 20, but I always have been brought up to look to my elders, so my grandparents, whoever, because there is so much wisdom. They have been through so much in their lives that you may never see as a person, especially our younger generations. They may never see. I mean, half of them don't even know what a telephone looked like. The ones that we used to dial. I mean, they look at it. So and I'm just taking a arbitrary thing and bringing it forward. But there are a lot of things that as women, because we take care of children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, I mean, you can just go on, where you bring so much substance without you actually realizing. And it's not only age, it could be culture, it could be across the board. And so what you're saying is, breaking this bias, it's super, super important. And, right in the beginning, I was thinking about your first question, and it starts with yourself. It starts with you. And if you can be that person that looks at yourself and, and make sure that you're not doing any of the things that you're pointing fingers at, then you can be an example to others. And so as women, I really feel that, when we go out in the world, you have to be that person, one of those 4,094 that got you here. You need to be one of those who stand out. And whether you're 40, 50, 60, 70, or 80, you always have something to contribute. Always.
I love that so much. And I think it's Layla Saad who talks about like how to be a good ancestor. So yes, those 4,000 plus, like there was, like we were willed into existence, right? Like if you think about all those numbers, and I know there's that question of like, do I deserve this? In my weak moments, I've been like, do I deserve this seat at this table? Well, I think our ancestors would tell us differently than whatever the narrative is in our heads, but it's also about what is the legacy of our actions, and it's a question I dance with, like, how can I make sure I'm being a good ancestor, and not from a place of creating pressure, but just intention and accountability. And so I appreciate what you offered, Karen. Are there any other offers? Another idea has come to mind, or another kind of story, because with this being International Women's Day, Women's Month, I also appreciate that that whole idea of, I think it's Shirley Chisholm who says, like, bring a folding chair to the table if there isn't a chair for you. And I also invite this idea of I feel like even in that quote, there's this idea that we are still seeking spaces at other people's tables built for other communities, built for other people. And in the work I do with leaders, I talk about, especially where you hold power and privilege, I'm like, why don't you go and ask for a seat at the tables where other communities who are not waiting for a seat, but creating their own tables, creating their own spaces, like this group that I'm a part of here today, that you didn't wait for someone, you've created your own table here. And so when we talk about shifting power and shifting dynamics, it's about not just those of us who are living the oppression to constantly try to look for a seat, but to be, for those with power and privilege, to consider, how can I go to tables and ask for a seat there, right? So just something to be thinking about.
While you were speaking, I couldn't help but think of the people in Ukraine, and especially the women, but also the men. I mean, the shifting dynamics in their families. All of a sudden, a couple of million have had to flee as refugees and leave the husbands behind. And now the women are alone with their children and maybe some other relatives, like an elderly parent or so on. And then the grandmothers there too. You probably have seen some of the clips on news channels about some of these grandmothers who have become very feisty. And the one, she was having Molotov cocktail bombs made in her backyard. And the other one the other day who said, if I was near Putin, I'd strangle him. I mean, and they're doing all kinds of things to aid each other. And I mean, their lives have just been overturned and overnight. And they've had a lot of triggers to deal with.
Definitely. And I think about the image, some of you may have seen, where there was just the strollers left at the subway stations and it just makes, it feels overwhelming. I think I'm in a moment personally where it's probably the most like empty my cup has felt in a long time. And so it's been important to me to look for those stories of hope and those moments. And sometimes my world gets small and I focus my work on what's happening. What can I actually affect here locally? And so that's kind of been a way that I've kind of, while I'm, holding space for all that's, all of the wars and battles that have been happening that don't get media attention, that are still ongoing as well, that, I appreciated, Louise, how you opened and held a space for those who are unwell. And I kind of said a prayer in my spirit for those who are, around across the globe, who are being displaced by war and being traumatized by those experiences. But I think I come back to the resilience of community and the healing potential that, coming back to kind of what we're talking about here, I think it's very connected to that Ukraine conversation, that what we can shift and touch is here. And if we as individuals, as leaders, can build our ability to engage with difference, to resource ourselves, I feel like those, and I'm thinking about the convoy that was happening here in January, and that was a part of what was really affecting me personally. And I was finding that I didn't have the ability to engage with difference in that moment. I was like, whenever I saw somebody on my social media who, was supporting the convoy, it was like, I can't see that. And like, I've had the gift of having a conversation with somebody I love, where I have social capital, where I have trust, where they told me they were supporting the convoy. And it was shocking for me personally. But we stayed in conversation, and I feel like I'm still unpacking, like, why was I able to hold space for that? Where in other spaces, I'm like, nope, I don't have that, because it's just so clear to me what the right stance is, for example, in that conversation. And so I just bring it back to all of us as leaders, and that, there is a lot happening across the globe that is worrying and upsetting and scary, and come back to, what can we do? How can we build our resilience as a collective, as individuals, to engage, with difference, because you can't just go out there and disrupt bias. Like we're not gonna self-care our way out of systemic oppression. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's just this recognition that we can't do this work from empty cups. We can't do this work at the expense of ourselves. And so I hope that's the message that you're leaving with, is that, yeah.
Any other questions? Yes. Christina?
No, but there was a thought on Ukraine just while we were all here and thinking about that at this time. Much help is needed, and don't forget to get in touch with your organizations, the Red Cross, whomever, send a little something, money or things that they need. They need medical things, they even need clothing, so it could be supplies or monetary donation to help the survivors there. So I and my friends have already done something too. So I just thought, while we're in that vein, there is a chance to help our fellow human being, even though they're not at our doorstep. So thanks very much for that contribution.
No problem, Christina. And we also have to remember, even in the Ukraine, that there are a lot of brown and dark bodies also because of this incident, that
Yes.
its ugly head has been shown as well.
Exactly.
So
Like
it's a time for great conversation and how we can do better.
Yeah, and to hold that ability, because I've also seen where someone has raised the issue of the Africans who were held back and denied spots on the trains leaving, that when anybody mentions that on social media, they're like, bombarded with messages of hate. And this moment is asking us to hold all of it, not just the fact that Ukraine has been attacked, but to say, okay, Ukraine is in war, but we also should be worried about the way white supremacy is continuing to show up, and that that's why it's important for us to be doing, this break the bias work, inclusion equity work, and to build the resilience to hold all of that conversation, not just the parts that make sense to us.
Thank you for that, because it's Christine again. When I saw that on the news as well, I was deeply disturbed, particularly because I in my life have lost a dear friend to cancer who wasn't as fair as I am. And as we used to joke to each other, I'm a color too, because look in the crayon box and look in your chalk box, and white is in there counted as colors. But I used to say to my friend Cecilia, who was a beautiful Black African girl, I said, you know what? I said, I'm not white anyways. I'm just a lighter color than you are. I'm not white. So anyways, yes, I was thinking of that when I saw these students abroad being treated the way they were. So
Yes.
Yes, thank you. That's quite a good topic there.
Any other questions?
Hello, just want to say something, Evelyn here.
Hello,
I'm
Evelyn.
really thankful for the comments raised the last speaker in terms of acknowledging, like I've heard everyone is concerned about the Ukraine and ought to be. It's almost like no one want to talk about what's happening in the context of within the war. There is another egregious act of racism. So acknowledging that and say it's wrong really brings more people to the table. Because I've heard many people who are involved in this work say, I'm just so turned off by what happened. But if we're actually giving voice to it and say it is wrong, but still work together, we can still work on a number of issues, I think it's really helpful. But it's like there's an elephant in the room and no one want to mention it. And people who are racialized are like, I can't believe no one even mentioned it. So I'm glad it was mentioned here and that there's some acknowledgement that notwithstanding the egregious act of war against the people of Ukraine, that within that context, there has been people who have been deeply hurt. Being from Jamaica, I know the Jamaican government, some of the kids were pulled off the train were Jamaican kids. and they came back and they were able to get back to Jamaica safely, thank goodness. But that's one of the experiences they had. They never experienced racism before. And so, they're doctors studying to be a doctor. Doesn't matter what they're studying for. It could be carpenter or teacher or whatever, janitorial staff. But just by virtue, they are foreign students. Most of them are in the medical field, notwithstanding. And that happened to them. So it really sent us a bad message across the world for those people. So I think us acknowledging it and then still moving towards fighting and supporting Ukrainian communities is a really good move, and give voice to those people this has happened to. It's deeply troubling. I just want to share that with you. In the Black community, whenever I speak to people, they are absolutely devastated that their humanity was denied. So it's not something else to say, oh, well, we stand and pray for the Ukraine, and don't acknowledge that what happened was wrong. So just want to share that with you. Thank you.
For that, Evelyn. Thank you for raising that. And when we talk about the work, it's about, when we bring it back to kind of what the theme of this talk was, if we're doing our work, if we're in those right postures and we understand the historical context and we understand the way oppression works, it should be natural for us to be upset about what Evelyn has raised, because we know that oppression doesn't move in simple, broad strokes, that there are these, that it works in insidious ways across multiple contexts, and it's intersectional. And so when we talk about what is the work and building our resilience to be able to hold that, yes, there's the war in a country, and there's oppression is playing out in these ways, that because this is how we've been socialized in times of crisis, we're seeing it play out where it's not been addressed. There hasn't been that work and that recognition that everybody is trying to flee conflict right now, and everyone deserves a seat on that train. Everyone, that it shouldn't be a prioritization the way it's been playing out. So thank you for that, Evelyn.
Yeah. Okay, if there's not any more questions at this time. If there are, after this meeting, feel free to email us and we can certainly pass it on to Leena.
Thank you. Thank you all for this time. It's been great to be in community with you all.
So I take this time on the behalf of the board members of the Women's Canadian Club of Hamilton. We thank you, Leena, for your time and wonderful educational information you provided us today. We appreciate you. I call upon our past president, Susan Ricketts. She's the chair of the upcoming Women's Spirit Awards in October, and she'll just give us some insight in terms of what we have done so far on International Women's Day. Thank you so much. Susan?
Thank you, Louise. I'd just like to bring you an update on our 2022 and second Women of Spirit Award. This award is to highlight and to celebrate the many and various achievements of an extraordinary woman in the Hamilton area who exemplifies the spirit of Irene MacDonald. Irene MacDonald, 1931 to 2002, was born in an orphanage in Hamilton and overcame many obstacles before becoming a champion diver. She won many medals and was reigned as Canada's champion diver from 1951 to 61. She won Canada's first Olympic diving medal, a bronze medal. She also won the 1954 and 58 Commonwealth Games diving medals. She became a dedicated administrative supporter to the diving fraternity, Canadian Sports Hall of Fame, received the Order of British Columbia, Female Athlete of the Year in 1958, and YWCA Woman of Distinction for Sports in 1998. When she finished her diving career, she went into media and also established a fund in support of children for diving. And so she became a broadcaster after her days were over of diving. Excuse me. In 2022, the recipient of this award will be a woman from Greater Hamilton who has made a significant contribution to this community, demonstrated compassion and serve as a role model, and continues to strive to make a better place for the world. This award is going to be presented on October the 19th during Women's History Month. The winner of the award will receive a $500 to a nonprofit organization by Scotiabank, and also receive a handcrafted award by Canadian artists from the Women's Canadian Club of Hamilton. I'd like to thank Lee, Allison, and Louise for all their great work on putting this up on the web. So applications are there, and the announcement as well. Applications are going to be closing on June the 30th and announced after that at the end of August. So the announcement has gone out. We're so excited about awarding this award again this year. If you were the first one 2 years ago, or is it 3? It's hard to remember. We had a wonderful day. The room was filled. There was such a wonderful feeling of just being there and celebrating women. And so we're hoping that everyone will be coming. Maybe you know somebody that could be nominated for the award as well. So that's to tell you about the Women of Spirit Award for 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. So any other information, feel free to visit our brand new looking website, and as well, feel free to call Susan. Leena, a question was asked to get your details. Do you mind sharing it in the chat to everyone? And wonderful. Please note this session was recorded and will be placed on our website for further viewing. Thank you, Leena. So remember, our website is www.wccofhamilton.ca. Thank you everyone for being here today. On the behalf of the Board of Directors of the Women Canadian Club of Hamilton, thank you for being here today. Remember to tell someone about this fabulous group. Take care.